On November 19, 1943, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita sat in his cabin aboard the battleship Haruna as it rocked gently at anchor in Singapore. A courier had just delivered a captured American naval circular, seized from the body of a downed pilot. The mimeographed sheets listed new ship commissions for the United States Navy. Kurita's staff read aloud, their voices wavering. Essex-Class carriers. Princeton, Yorktown, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hornet. The names rolled on like a litany. 12 new carriers, all commissioned within the year. Kurita removed his glasses and pressed them to the desk. The faint hum of the ship's ventilators filled the silence. "It is impossible," one officer whispered. Yet it was not. The Essex-Class had begun to roll from American shipyards with a speed no admiral in Tokyo had believed possible. Only a year earlier, Japanese commanders had considered the balance precarious but survivable. The 4 fleet carriers lost at Midway were devastating. Yet Yamato and Musashi still loomed, and air groups still filled decks in the Central Pacific. Intelligence suggested America might build replacements by 1945. Instead, by 1943, Essex hulls slid into the water at Newport News, Brooklyn, and Norfolk. Each displaced 27,000 tons, carrying up to 90 aircraft. By 1945, 24 would be in service. The laughter that had once greeted rumors of American shipbuilding now curdled into dread. Japanese prisoners of war captured at Tarawa, and Kwajalein began to glimpse the truth themselves. Hauled through island depots, they watched rows of aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, engines ticking in the tropical heat. Jeeps buzzed like insects, ferrying mail and crates of Coca-Cola. The smell of aviation fuel hung thick, a haze over the coral. Prisoners whispered that each Essex seemed to carry not just planes, but an entire city. In their own navy, fuel shortages forced carriers to sail half-empty. Here, American ships launched strikes morning and evening, pausing only to refuel from tankers that appeared on the horizon like clockwork. The Essex program did not stand alone. Shipyard logs reveal that in 1943, American yards produced 18 million tons of shipping. Liberty ships launched in weeks, sometimes days. Workers at Kaiser's Richmond yard set records, welding a cargo ship in under 5 days. While Japanese yards built perhaps 1 large carrier per year, American slipways turned out Essex hulls in parallel, cranes swinging day and night. The sensory details impressed themselves even on visitors. The hiss of welding torches, the clang of steel plates, the constant rumble of trains delivering more steel. Production itself was a kind of drumbeat. For prisoners transported to the mainland, the industrial miracle was impossible to ignore. One Japanese officer, captured after the fall of Saipan, was shipped through San Francisco. As his train rolled east, he glimpsed yards packed with aircraft fuselages, thousands waiting for wings. In Kansas, the smell of wheat fields stretched for miles, and grain elevators towered like fortresses. He later wrote in a secret diary, "This is not a land at war. This is a land feeding war while still living in plenty." American camps reflected that same surplus. POWs ate bread fresh from bakeries, butter melted on toast, coffee steaming in tin mugs. Red Cross parcels added chocolate and cigarettes. At Christmas, whole turkeys roasted, the scent of sage drifting down barracks halls. Even medical care was generous. A prisoner treated for appendicitis recovered in a clean infirmary. Sulfa drugs at his bedside, electric heaters humming. In Tokyo, civilians burned scraps of wood to stay warm. In America, prisoners of war healed under blankets washed weekly. The Essex carriers themselves became legends. In the Central Pacific, their decks seemed inexhaustible. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, 15 American carriers, most of them Essex-Class, launched over 900 aircraft. Japanese flyers dove into the storm of flak, but American radar and fighter direction proved overwhelming. By the end of the day, over 300 Japanese planes had been destroyed. A captured pilot later admitted, "We rose into the sky like moths into fire." His comrades who survived captivity told similar stories. The sheer number of planes rising from flat gray decks stunned them more than any battleship broadside. Arithmetic made ideology collapse. By 1944, America had launched more than a dozen Essex carriers. while Japan managed only Taiho and a handful of conversions. Each Essex displaced more than twice as much as Japan's light carriers. Each carried air groups trained with thousands of flight hours, supported by millions of barrels of oil. Japanese officers who once boasted of spiritual strength now admitted privately that fuel and steel mattered more than courage. In camps across the Midwest, chaplains offered services in Japanese, and some prisoners attended quietly. One noted in a letter that the hymns reminded him of discipline back home, but here they were sung under electric light, with full stomachs. Another, studying English in a camp class, read American newspapers listing new ship commissions almost weekly. The smell of chalk, the scrape of pencils mingled with the gnawing realization that he was watching the arithmetic of defeat in real time. Many reveals hit hardest when prisoners worked nearby farms. They picked apples until their arms ached, only to watch crates stacked high, some bruised fruit discarded. They shoveled corn into bins while tractors roared past, their engines more reliable than the planes they once flew. Abundance was not just visible, it was tactile, seeping into every pore. When guards mentioned casually that thousands of those crops ended up aboard carriers feeding sailors, the prisoners fell silent. By early 1945, the truth was unbearable. Okinawa brought it into final focus. Nearly 2,300 American ships gathered offshore, many of them Essex-Class carriers. Kamikaze pilots dove in desperation, but replacements sailed from American yards faster than losses mounted. Reports claimed 544,000 tons of supplies were unloaded during the campaign. To Japanese prisoners sitting thousands of miles away, the figures were crushing. They had once laughed at rumors of endless carriers. Now they realized the United States had built a fleet so large that even sacrifice itself could not dent it. And yet the story did not end with despair. After surrender, many former prisoners saw Liberty ships docking in Japan with grain sacks marked USA. The same shipyards that had launched Essex hulls now launched relief. Families who had starved under blockade now ate bread baked from American wheat. The smell of flour dust in bakeries, the warmth of loaves rising in ovens, became the coda to a war once fought with hunger. For those who had mocked American carriers, the memory never left. They had underestimated not machines but systems, shipyards, power grids, and farms operating in concert. The Essex-Class was not simply a ship. It was proof that victory belonged to those who could build faster than the enemy could destroy. And what Japanese prisoners witnessed next would drive that point home. The full weight of an industrial arsenal turned loose on the world stage. By the beginning of 1944, Axis prisoners across America no longer doubted that the United States was producing ships in staggering numbers. Yet many still clung to the belief that this pace must collapse under strain, that strikes, shortages, or fatigue would cripple the machine. The second revelation came when they learned not only about shipyards, but also about the factories, power grids, and consumer culture that made the Essex program possible. America was not exhausting itself. It was accelerating. Shipyards were the first window into this scale. At Newport News, cranes swung ceaselessly over slips, sparks from welding torches showering like fireworks even after midnight. At Brooklyn Navy Yard, 3 Essex-Class hulls took shape side by side, steel plates ringing as riveters hammered them into place. Records show that in 1943 alone, 6 Essex carriers were commissioned, with more already fitting out. Each displaced 27,000 tons, each carried 90 aircraft, and each was launched faster than Japanese admirals believed possible. For prisoners who had grown up seeing a single cruiser celebrated as a national achievement, the idea of carriers emerging monthly was beyond comprehension. Factories inland provided the fuel and fittings. Detroit rolled out trucks by the tens of thousands, engines destined for carrier decks and supply trains. In Cleveland, turbines for warships spun from assembly lines. Willow Run, the bomber plant outside Ypsilanti, produced more than 5,000 aircraft in 1944 at a pace of 1 B-24 every hour. Axis officers whispered among themselves, if planes were built so quickly, how many more could carriers launch and recover without pause? The power that fed these facilities became another shock. The Tennessee Valley Authority generated more than 17 billion kilowatt-hours in 1944. Hydroelectric dams pulsed with a steady roar, turbines humming as water rushed through gates. For prisoners accustomed to blackouts back home, the constant glow of American cities seemed surreal. Even inside camps, light bulbs burned all night, radios crackled, and fans whirred in summer. Guards joked about electric bills, while Axis captives thought of their families studying by candlelight. Electricity was not a luxury here. It was the bloodstream of an empire at war. Consumer goods carried a quieter message. Magazines circulated in camps showed ads for refrigerators, washing machines, and radios, all promised for post-war delivery. Workers who spent shifts riveting carriers earned wages high enough to afford luxuries. Families still rationed sugar and tires, but they bought bicycles, phonographs, even new suits. The glossy ink smelled of plenty, and the implication was clear. America was building fleets without bankrupting daily life. Axis soldiers realized their homes rationed shoes while their captors' children dreamed of ice cream and toys. Food abundance hammered the point home. Farms harvested more than 1.2 billion bushels of wheat in 1943, 23 billion pounds of beef, and 4 billion bushels of corn. Each serviceman received about 4,000 calories daily, with fresh bread, butter, and fruit. Prisoners themselves ate nearly 3,000 calories. They saw milk dumped in ditches when rail cars ran late, smelled oranges rotting in piles too large to salvage, and watched bruised apples discarded from orchards. To men whose families back home boiled weeds into soup, the sight of waste was both proof and torment. Numbers spread through camp bulletins reinforced what eyes already knew. In 1944, America built 96,000 aircraft, 48,000 tanks, and 18 million tons of shipping. Steel mills poured 89 million tons of output, while oil fields pumped 1.7 billion barrels. Axis prisoners counted the trains roaring past with over 100 cars each, the acrid coal smoke thick in the air, and understood. These figures were not exaggeration. They were lived reality. Some resisted belief. Hardliners sneered that strikes would cripple industry, or that Americans lacked discipline. But each week, papers reported new ships launched, new carriers commissioned, new harvests completed. Guards grumbled about coffee prices or overtime shifts, but their complaints were casual, not desperate. Compared to letters from Europe describing bombed cities and empty shelves, the contrast was unbearable. Mini reveals arrived daily. One prisoner watched a Jeep ferry mail across a camp road, its engine buzzing confidently. Another saw convoys of trucks stacked with flour sacks, the smell of grain drifting in the wind. Others saw chaplains arriving in jeeps, hymnals piled in the back. The vehicle mocked as a toy became proof of abundance on wheels, multiplied by the hundreds of thousands. The Essex carriers remained the ultimate symbol. By late 1944, headlines declared that 15 American carriers had fought at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Nearly 900 aircraft launched from their decks in one day. Prisoners stared at those figures. In their navy, shortages of oil had grounded entire air groups. In America, carriers sailed with decks full, refueled at sea, and returned to action within days. The Essex was not a single ship. It was a system backed by steel, oil, and food so plentiful that its captains never feared exhaustion. By the close of 1944, even the most loyal prisoners admitted privately that America's production was unbreakable. They had seen the evidence in shipyards and factories, tasted it in bread and butter, and heard it in the endless whistle of trains. America was not straining to the point of collapse. It was growing stronger each month. Yet all of this remained for them secondhand. They had seen the abundance in print and from a distance. Soon, many would be sent to work directly in fields and depots, touching the soil, tools, and machines themselves. What they witnessed next would cut even deeper into ideology, showing that surplus was not theory but reality under their very hands. By the winter of 1944, Axis prisoners of war held across the United States had already eaten the bread. Read the statistics and glimpsed convoys stretching across the horizon. Still, doubts lingered in quiet corners of the barracks. Was all this abundance a carefully staged illusion, meant to impress captives? That skepticism began to unravel once prisoners were assigned to labor details. On farms, in lumber yards, and in workshops, they touched America's wealth with their own hands. What had seemed unbelievable on paper became undeniable in sweat and calluses. Farm assignments were the most common. At dawn, columns of POWs marched into fields under the steady roar of tractors. The smell of damp earth and diesel clung to their clothes as they watched combines harvest grain, faster than villages in Europe could by hand. In Kansas, prisoners shoveled wheat into silos that towered higher than church steeples. German corporal admitted privately that a single silo here held more than his entire hometown, consumed in a year. In 1944 alone, U.S. farms produced 1.2 billion bushels of wheat and 4 billion bushels of corn. With each shovel of grain, prisoners realized those staggering numbers were not inflated. They were lived reality. Orchards offered another revelation. In Washington state, prisoners picked apples until their hands ached, the sweet smell of fruit filling the air. Yet truckloads of bruised apples were discarded, piled high for compost. In Italy or Germany, even spoiled fruit was salvaged for jam or animal feed. Here, waste was routine. A diary recovered after the war recorded the shock. In Europe, children cry for fruit. Here, it rots by the ton. That mountain of bruised apples proved more convincing than any Allied leaflet. Forestry details carried a similar message. In Minnesota, prisoners swung saws through towering pines, resin sharp in their noses while logging trucks groaned under loads headed for mills. A single crew cut 12,000 cords of wood in one season, according to camp records. Prisoners saw piles of offcuts burned without thought, smoke drifting into clear skies. Families back home scavenged twigs for winter fires. In America, surplus lumber was treated as disposable. Workshops and factories deepened the lesson. Though barred from sensitive plants, POWs were assigned to canneries, textile mills, and repair depots. Inside, the clang of presses and the hiss of steam overwhelmed the senses. The air smelled of hot oil and metal filings. One German engineer, captured in North Africa, marveled at shelves stacked with spare motors. In Hamburg, he had fought to salvage a single damaged engine. In America, replacements stood in neat rows, waiting. "They treat machines like bread rolls," he wrote. Always another in reserve. Amid this labor, humane touches unsettled them further. Red Cross parcels arrived with chocolate, cigarettes, and soap. Chaplains organized services, sometimes in German or Italian. The smell of pine benches mingling with hymnals. At Christmas, entire turkeys roasted in camp kitchens, filling the air with sage and smoke. Prisoners ate stuffing and pie while letters from home spoke of hunger and ration lines. Generosity weighed heavier than punishment, breaking down ideological walls more effectively than lectures. Medical care reinforced the same message. Camps maintained infirmaries with sulfa drugs, clean beds, and, by 1945, even penicillin. A young Italian soldier treated for pneumonia was placed under electric heaters, nurses checking his pulse with steady hands. He admitted afterward that such care would not have been available even for officers in Rome. The antiseptic, sting of alcohol, and the low hum of heaters made the contrast undeniable. Education. Programs widened cracks in belief. English classes, math lessons, even agricultural courses filled hours. Chalk scraped across blackboards as instructors explained crop rotation or mechanical drawing. One prisoner studied soil science and realized America's record harvests were the result of research, not luck. Another learned mechanics, marveling at textbooks showing conveyor systems. Knowledge flowed freely, itself a product of surplus. For men from bombed cities where schools lay in ruins, it was a disorienting gift. Hardliners resisted. They warned fellow prisoners that kindness was a trap, that labor was exploitation, that propaganda lurked in every classroom. Yet the daily grind eroded their words. A man might denounce American decadence at night, then spend the next day stacking flour sacks so plentiful that torn ones were discarded. He might claim to despise the enemy's system, yet ride to work in a jeep fueled by gasoline, more abundant than his army had seen in years. Rhetoric crumbled against the evidence of routine abundance. Mini reveals occurred constantly. A prisoner in Michigan shoveled potatoes into piles taller than a man, the earthy smell saturating the barn. Another in Texas watched milk poured into ditches when deliveries ran late, the sweet sour stench clinging to boots. Each moment reminded them that back home, families queued for scraps while here, surplus spoiled unattended. The numbers they overheard matched their experiences. In 1944, American canneries processed over 3 billion pounds of vegetables. Ammunition factories produced 40 billion cartridges. Steel mills poured 89 million tons, 3 times Germany's. Shipyards launched 18 million tons of shipping in a year. Even if camp guards had exaggerated, the prisoners knew from sweat and sight that the numbers were close to truth. Human encounters gave the statistics flesh. Farmers sometimes handed out apples to work details. Guards shared cigarettes or explained baseball rules. Chaplains presided over funerals when prisoners died. American soldiers standing silently as coffins were lowered. The scrape of shovels, the scent of pine coffins, and the solemn respect shook many more than cruelty ever could. Abundance had enabled dignity. By early 1945, diaries recorded sleepless nights. Prisoners lay under clean blankets, radios playing jazz in the distance, haunted by memories of bombed-out towns and ration cards. One German wrote, "We thought hunger was our strength. Here I see that bread is strength." For him, it was not propaganda that changed his mind, but the weight of grain sacks he had lifted with his own hands. The realization was bitter. Axis armies had marched under banners of sacrifice, believing that endurance could defeat material might. Yet America had shown that comfort, not scarcity, sustained armies. Each bushel harvested, each log cut, each spare engine on a shelf demonstrated that industrial democracy was not weakness. It was power multiplied. And still, these revelations were fragments. Prisoners had labored in orchards and mills, tasted abundance, and seen waste unimaginable in Europe. But the decisive proof would not come from fields or workshops. It would come on battlefields where Essex-Class carriers, Liberty ships, and endless convoys turned statistics into strategy. What they witnessed next would show that victory was written not in ideology, but in supply. By 1945, the question had been settled. Axis prisoners no longer debated whether America's abundance was real. They had eaten it, worked it, and witnessed it in every bushel of grain, every truckload of timber, every spare engine left idle. Yet the final overwhelming proof came not in silos or canneries, but on the grand stage of war itself. There, the Essex-Class carriers became more than ships. They became monuments to a system that could build faster than enemies could destroy. The invasion of Normandy offered the first undeniable demonstration of this scale. On June 6, 1944, the Allied fleet stretched across the Channel with more than 7,000 vessels. Newspapers reported that within a week, 326,000 men, 50,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of cargo had landed in France. For prisoners behind American fences, the arithmetic was staggering. They remembered milk wasted in fields and grain elevators bursting in Kansas, then realized those same surpluses fed and fueled an invasion larger than anything in human history. Axis generals had promised that U-boats would choke supply. Instead, convoys stretched unbroken from New York to Cherbourg. But it was in the Pacific where the Essex carriers made their legend. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, 15 American carriers, most of them Essex-Class, launched nearly 900 aircraft. Japanese pilots rose to meet them, but radar-guided fighters cut through formations with ruthless precision. Over 300 enemy planes fell in a single day. Prisoners reading bulletins in Midwest camps whispered that their comrades had been swallowed by the sea of planes. The Essex was not merely a ship, it was a platform for endless replenishment. While Japan struggled to field a single new fleet carrier, America commissioned another Essex almost monthly. The numbers spoke louder than any speech. By the end of 1944, the United States had built 18 Essex-Class carriers, with more on the way. Each displaced 27,000 tons. Each carried up to 90 aircraft, each supported by fleets of oilers and supply ships. Japan, by contrast, managed only Taiho and a handful of converted hulls. Ammunition plants produced 40 billion cartridges that year. Steel output soared past 89 million tons. Oil wells pumped 1.7 billion barrels. To Axis prisoners stacking crates or loading wagons, those figures matched the evidence they had touched. Okinawa in 1945 sealed the verdict. Nearly full 300 American ships assembled offshore, with Essex decks launching wave after wave of strikes. Kamikazes dove in desperation, their explosions shaking the sea, yet replacements arrived faster than losses. Records show that 544,000 tons of supplies were unloaded during the campaign. Axis prisoners, reading these headlines under the steady glow of American light bulbs, realized that sacrifice itself could not bridge the gap. For every plane destroyed, 10 more waited. For every ship damaged, a new hull slid down a slipway. The sensory impressions from captivity returned in memory as metaphors for these battles. The steady hum of electric fans in camps became the pulse of power grids lighting airfields. The smell of roasting turkeys at Christmas mirrored the hot meals served to soldiers storming Normandy. The buzz of jeeps circling fences was echoed by the endless convoys rolling across France. Abundance was not a sideshow. It was the central weapon of war. After surrender, the contrast sharpened into pain. German officers returned to bombed cities where families boiled weeds for soup. Italians found villages stripped bare. Japanese veterans walked through ashes where neighborhoods had stood. For many, captivity had been the most abundant period of the war. Full meals, chaplains, medical care, and even holiday feasts. They remembered apples discarded, milk poured away, lights burning all night. In the ruins of home, those memories felt surreal, like glimpses of another world. Historians probing defeated leaders pressed the question, why had the Axis lost? The answers were strikingly consistent. Albert Speer admitted that once American production hit full stride, the Reich's defeat was inevitable. Japanese admirals confessed that every carrier lost was permanent, while America launched replacements faster than they could be sunk. Italian generals acknowledged that their armies marched on empty stomachs against foes who never went hungry. What prisoners had witnessed in fields and factories was echoed at the highest level. Industry, not ideology, had determined the outcome. The Essex-Class became a lasting symbol of that truth. For sailors who fought on them, they were floating cities, each with bakeries, workshops, and hospitals. For Axis observers, they were nightmares made of steel. Too many, too resilient, too constant. And yet after war's end, their power transformed. Some Essex carriers remained in service for decades, launching jets in Korea and Vietnam. Others were scrapped, their steel melted into peacetime goods. Liberty ships that once carried trucks now carried sacks of flour stamped USA, feeding former enemies. The same system that had crushed the Axis became the engine of recovery. Epilogue. The story of Japanese admirals dismissing American carriers ended with dread, then silence, then recognition. They had not underestimated a single ship, but an entire system. Shipyards, power grids, farms, and factories working in unison. The Essex-Class was proof that victory came not from rhetoric, but from abundance. Not from sacrifice, but from supply. Wars are not won by hunger and desperation. They are won by plenty, by dignity, by lights that never go out. If you found this journey compelling, subscribe for the next exploration of how ordinary machines became extraordinary instruments of history.